You two are sitting there and you look like objects in your room, and I'm over here. And if we were in the same room, I'd be a third object in your room. Our boundaries are our skin, and that's the way we think of ourselves. But at the cellular level, where are our boundaries? So you're shedding skin cells into the environment all the time. The dust in your room is in large part just your dead skin cells, which is a little disgusting, but I'm a pathologist, so I can, I'm okay with it. But now we know about the microbiome, which are the bacteria and other living things that line the surfaces of your body and all the crevices inside your body. And we know that without our microbiome, if we were completely sterile, we would die within days. Our skin would start to crack, we'd get infections, we'd be unable to absorb food, our immune systems would go haywire. So we're not a living human body without our microbiome. And current estimates are 50% of your cells are your human cells and 50% of your living body necessarily are these bacteria and other stuff. So at the cellular level, where are your boundaries? All the people who share a home and their pets all share a single microbiome. You come in with your own microbiomes, but within a very short time, this has been studied and measured, your microbiomes emerge into one single system. So at the cellular level, where are your boundaries? They're the boundaries of the spaces we occupy with other people and animals and whatever. At the molecular level, where are your boundaries? Simplistically, we breathe out carbon dioxide. Our carbon dioxide of our bodies goes out to the plants. They take it in, make it part of their bodies, and give us oxygen. At the molecular level, the boundary of our bodies is the entire biomass of the planet. At the atomic level, we see ourselves as being these isolated individuals walking around on this rock we call planet Earth. But there is no atom in our bodies that we didn't breathe, eat, or drink from the planet. So are we separate individuals walking around on the surface of planet Earth, or are we the atomic substance of the Earth that in 3.5 billion years have self-organized according to the rules of chaos and complexity theory into living things that think of themselves as separate? When Curiosity went to Mars and I was blown away, and 14-year-old geek, like, oh boy, if I could have been a part of NASA. The brilliance of the scientists and engineers at NASA that they could send this robot to Mars. That's true, but equally true is that it took 3.5 billion years for Earth to figure out how to organize itself so that it could reach out and touch its neighbor.
100%.
At the quantum level, there are no boundaries. Each of us is fully an expression of the universe, one single large unity within which there's no separation.
It's Mayim Bialik's breakdown. She's gonna break it down for you, because she knows a thing or two. And now she's gonna break down. It's a breakdown. She's gonna break it down.
Hi, I'm Mayim Bialik.
And I'm Jonathan Cohen.
Welcome to our breakdown, the place where we break things down so you don't have to. How about this? Can you break down our entire existence?
The unity of everything and the danger to the establishment that it is.
This episode ends with me on the floor.
Like most should, but don't.
We're speaking to Dr. Neil Theise. And if I were to read you his title, you'd be like, what? How does she end up on the floor talking about everything in the world? He's a professor of pathology at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. He's a pioneer in adult stem cell plasticity. He was one of the researchers and professors who discovered what's been called, I think he said, the 80th organ. He's one of the researchers who identified the human interstitium, which is the fluid cavity that surrounds all of your organs and essentially your entire body. He's a longtime student of Zen Buddhism and also mystical Kabbalistic thought. And he has studied complexity theory. But it's basically the theory of the unity of our experience as scientifically and psychologically grounded beings. It's an unbelievable conversation. I'm just saying it. Like, it's unbelievable.
Should we talk a little bit about the interstitium and like why that's so important?
Well,
like we kind of glaze over it right now.
Well, I don't want to glaze over it, but I need people to hear how we get there, because we literally make this man go on a journey from the atomic quantum level to the mystical, like the mystical transcendental level, and it connects to what connects our entire body with our emotional system. He basically explains why
we are not separate. Everything is connected.
Yes.
And separation is but an illusion.
The thing that I love about Dr. Theise is that he is not coming at his approach to understanding the mind-body connection from any particular perspective other than one as a pathologist and an observer. This is not a man coming from a particular religious or political perspective. It is plain as day to this level of thinker. And also he's funny, he's gentle. Like, I just want to like have a cup of tea with him.
Get your popcorn. This is a long one.
I could have talked to him a lot longer.
Don't worry. Near the end, we get to shamans and altered states of reality and
boundaries. Like literally what psychological, have you ever had an experience where you're like, I cannot physically be around that person without it feeling like it's going to make me throw up, need to flee, or crawl out of my skin? He literally explains what that means.
He also explains the supernatural and things that cannot be explained.
And why you can't explain them and shouldn't try.
Let's do this.
Let's welcome Dr. Neil Theise, author of Notes on Complexity. Welcome to The Breakdown. Break it down. It's so nice to have you here.
It's so nice to be here. Thank you both.
We are both very interested in you as a scientist, as a writer, and just as a human being. There are many, many unicorn aspects to you. I'm just going to come out and say that right away. You know, your book, Notes on Complexity, A Scientific Theory of Connection, Consciousness, and Being, it just came out. And, you know, the best way I can describe it, and not that you're asking me, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. Best way I can describe it is kind of like, it's the most important aspects of chemistry, physics, and philosophy, and how they all relate to our actual human experience. Does that feel safe?
Yeah, that's as good as I've heard. I've been looking for an elevator pitch for 2 years with my agent and my editor and my publishers. And yeah, that's great.
Okay, good. So you have a very interesting, you know, kind of path. I mean, your whole career feels like a very interesting path. I actually, you know, you're a professor of pathology, and you know, you've been a pioneer in stem cell plasticity and stem cell research, which I think, you know, has gotten its kind of fair share of sort of cultural interest, as it should. But in particular, what Jonathan and I were really intrigued by was the interstitium research that you were part of from a handful of years ago, which I don't feel is unrelated to sort of the work that you do. And I think where I think we should start is, and I'm not asking this from, you know, a facetious place. Why write this book? Meaning you have so many different avenues of your life that deserve their own books, both your personal journey. You've been a student of Zen Buddhism for many decades. You originally started as a potential rabbinical student. You know, have held space with one of kind of the greatest, you know, mystical rabbis of our generation, Reb Zalman. And so you have all these interesting paths, and, you know, your stem cell work is fascinating. Your interstitium work is fascinating, but this book is kind of like your theory of everything. So what made you say, like, this is where I want to put my deepest thought, and essentially giving birth, you know, to this child that is this book?
Good question. The general answer is that I've been giving talks on this stuff for a little over 20 years now. all this material, the entire book, is basically a book version of a talk that I started giving in around 2002, 2003. In the author's note at the beginning of the book, I talk about how my stem cell research led me to meet this artist, Jane Prophet.
Mm-hmm.
And as part of an art science interdisciplinary collaboration, people wanted to record how we would speak to each other to see how a scientist and an artist.
What's it like when they talk? How do they communicate?
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, it doesn't always work. But she and I were the instinct of our mutual friend who put us together, Peter Ride, and he actually just wanted us in a room together. But he curates these kinds of things, or did back then. It doesn't always work, but he had an instinct that it would with us, because any interdisciplinary collaboration, and I'm sure both of you have experienced this many times, positive and negative, you have to have people who are willing to speak about what they do and be able to communicate, but also listen quietly while the other person introduces their language. And so we just conversed, telling each other what we did. And when I started to talk about cells moving around the body, as we were starting to research and define, the language I was using recalled to her how complexity theorists talk about ants forming colonies.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, what's complexity theory? And so it was often running from there. And, most of my career, I do sort of wander around. It's because I basically follow my nose. I'm not good at picking one thing and then diving down for several decades. What's interesting catches my attention and I go after it. And suddenly complexity was something that was catching my attention. And as I dug, it unfolded that it wasn't just about bodies and cells and colonies and ants. It turns out to be about the whole universe. And so I started giving talks on that, starting with my Zen group, actually, I think in 2003. And then it just unfurled. But I didn't think I would ever be able to write a book. I can speak about it in 45, 50 minutes with a Q&A after. And I've spoken about it in front of hardcore scientists, fifth graders. My nephew, when he was in fifth grade, wanted me to come and talk to him about his class. And they got it. They had to hold the buses at the end of the day because the students, they called all the parents and told them we're holding the buses because the kids want to keep asking me questions.
Wow.
About it. So it has this general appeal. But to write a book, I thought it had to be like 400 or 500 pages and fully annotated and like a real text. So I wasn't going to write it. My mom, as she declined over the last few years of her life, started having interesting metaphysical experiences, shall we say, talking to dead people, spirit guides from the universe showing up, instantaneous enlightenment experiences. So I wanted to write about that. And my agent, Amanda Annis, and I sent that out, got interest, but all of the positive interest, they said, but why would we want to hear about this from this guy? And a couple of those publishers went online and heard my talks, and they said, oh, we'd want to hear what that guy has to say, so he has to write that book. So that's why I wrote this book now, because it's the only way to get to tell the story of my mom. But then once I was in it, this was just my mom leading the way as usual. And Amanda and the folks at Spiegel and Grau, my editors and my publisher, helped show me, no, you could do it this way. Just make a book version of your talk. And that's why it's so compact.
Yeah.
It's,
Well, it's compact, but I'd like to underscore it's very dense. I mean, it's I don't want to say that it's not approachable, because I think you write beautifully. And I think you write in a way that a lot of people, especially people who are, I'd like to say, kind of amateur scientists, meaning people who have an inquisitive mind, people who want to think deeply, people who want to understand how philosophy, religion, and quantum mechanics actually are one thing, connect.
My Bialik's Breakdown is supported by BetterHelp.
Every week, I try to balance my time effectively as I can between work commitments, my commitments as a mom, and also my commitments to a ton of other people in my life. But I also can't forget, I gotta make a commitment to myself. And I don't always excel at balancing this out. It's very easy to get caught up in first what everyone else needs from me, and I forget that I need time for myself. I need to spend time working on myself. And if we spend all of our time giving to other people, it can leave us feeling stretched thin and burned out. Who, me? Stretched thin? Burned out? Never. Kidding. Therapy can give you the tools to find more balance in your life so that you can keep supporting others, but not leave yourself behind. If you're thinking of starting therapy, Jonathan and I cannot recommend it highly enough. Maybe give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch at any time for no additional charge.
Find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/break today to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/break.
Mayim Bialik's Breakdown is supported by Squarespace. What's Squarespace? It's the all-in-one platform that helps you build your brand and grow your business online. They help you stand out with a beautiful website, engage with your audience, and sell anything you want to sell. Your products, content you create, even your time. They make it really easy for creators and educators to monetize their content and expertise in a way that specifically fits their brand. So there's these member areas where you can unlock a new revenue stream for your business and free up time in your schedule by selling access to gated content like classes, online courses, or newsletters. Stand out in any inbox with Squarespace email campaigns. This is really awesome. You can collect email subscribers and convert them into customers. Start with an email template, customize it, like apply your brand ingredients like your site colors and your logo. Built-in analytics measure the impact of every send. Also, if you have causes that you support, gather contributions with PayPal, Apple Pay, Stripe, and Venmo. Gain powerful insights into who's visiting your site and how they're interacting with your content with the analytics tools, including page views, traffic sources, time on site, most read content, audience geography, and so much more. Squarespace also has powerful blogging tools to share stories, photos, videos, and updates. You can categorize, share, and schedule your posts to make your content work for you, and display posts from your social profiles on your website, as well as automatically pushing website content to your favorite social media channels so that your followers can do the same. Go to squarespace.com/breakdown for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, use offer code BREAKDOWN to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Maybe you could explain to us a little bit, I'm very interested in simplicity, but I'm also very interested in complexity. So I'm interested in simplicity in terms of, understanding living in a culture of constant consuming, right? And the notion that we're sort of driven, in many cases in an ant-like fashion, to kind of constantly be working, doing. And I think that my interest in simplicity doesn't feel in opposition to your notion of complexity. Can you talk about why complexity actually gives us an understanding of the universe as more accessible and in many ways simpler?
Yeah. I mean, a common, when you Google people talking about complexity online or, articles in magazines for lay people, there are a few out there. Often the thing is complexity is actually simple and such things, because it is. I mean, if it weren't simple, I'm not primarily a mathematician. I wouldn't be able to get this and do this, but it is simple. Just to place it, complexity describes how things that interact with each other give rise to larger scale structures on the global level as they interact locally. And what preceded it scientifically, which many of your audience probably have at least heard of, is chaos, chaos theory and fractals. And with computers being developed and computer modeling being possible in the 60s and 70s, I guess it's the 70s, chaos theory was first elaborated. And that entered the popular culture fairly quickly. Most importantly, probably because of the book Chaos by James Glick, which became a bestseller. Complexity theory followed, but that hasn't really entered the popular domain. And what they noticed when they were playing around with chaos is that mathematically or computationally in computer models, there was this zone that wasn't perfect order like we think of it, billiard balls, or complete disorder like molecules randomly in a gas, or what had now been recognized as chaotic systems, as a different type of order. At the boundary between order and chaos, there was another realm, and that was the realm of complexity. And it turns out that's the realm in which life is described. It's an information-rich processing realm, and the math there describes all living systems and all things that arise from living systems interacting with each other. So it describes how ants form colonies or humans form cities and neighborhoods and cultures and economies. But as I said, this is what Jane recognized and pointed me towards. Just as ants follow these rules to form a colony, the cells in our bodies follow the very same rules to form our organs, tissues, and bodies. The question then for me was, are cells then things? You know, a colony from a distance looks like a solid shape, even if it might be moving. You go up close and it's just ants. Or if you see a flock of birds in the sky, it looks like a thing unless you know it's birds. A murmuration of starlings can surprise you because you hear a noise, you look up, and there's this giant balloon or ship, and then you realize, no, it's just birds. But you go in close to the bird or the ant or to my finger pointing, the bird and the ant and the finger disappear the way the colony, the flock, and my fingers disappear as you go to the cellular level, and they just become a colony or a flock of cells. And cells are just self-organizing molecules, and those are just self-organizing atoms all the way down to the quantum realm. And so complexity describes these all very simply. And the simple rules are, one, too few, you don't get complexity.
Numbers matter is how you describe it.
Numbers matter is rule number one. 3 ants don't make a colony, but 25 ants do, because if you buy an ant colony, back in my day from the back of a comic book, then they dig tunnels. They have a little cemetery where they put the bodies of dead ants. They make food lines. But as they die off, you start to lose that complexity. And if you have 250 ants, it's way more complex. And if you have 25,000 ants, it's way more complex. In human terms, a village is not a city, is not a megalopolis, but the same mathematics describes them. So across all these things, that's rule number one. It's very simple. The more you have, the more complex you have. The more diversity of interactions between those individuals, the more complexity you have. Rule number two is there has to be what are called feedback loops, negative and positive feedback loops. And a negative feedback loop doesn't mean bad. It means that things stay within a balanced, what's called homeostatic zone, a healthy area. So the air conditioner turns off when the room is cold enough, and then turns back on when the room heats up. And so it stays in this nice, comfortable realm. That's a negative feedback loop. A positive feedback loop would be something like if the room gets warmer, the heater in the room turns up and the room gets warmer still, and it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And you can have those in a complex system, but the negative feedback loops have to predominate to keep things in balance. And there's a nice example of this that everybody knows in humans. You get a fever. That's a positive feedback loop. Your temperature, your body temperature getting hotter and hotter in order to help optimize fighting off an infection. But when the infection is cleared, the negative feedback loops come back in and bring you back into that nice, healthy range. So there have to be negative feedback loops that predominate.
Or Western medicine says you shouldn't have a fever, and it turns off the fever, and we wonder why we keep getting sick.
Give you Tylenol.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. No, exactly. Well, and one of the things that's interesting, whenever I talk to people, I get different ways in which they relate to this material. And in all the podcasts I've done for the book so far, this is the first one where someone has pointed at integrative medicine. And so now that's one of the things I research.
We're just getting warmed up.
Yeah. No, I'm sure. I'll go there.
Oh, we'll take you there. Talk about rule 4. Randomness is key. What is it about randomness?
This is my favorite one. And this was actually what caught my attention when I first started to study it. If you have a bunch of things interacting with each other, let's say ants, then if they're if the rules that govern their interactions allow for complete freedom, complete randomness, you just have a bunch of ants wandering around. They don't actually start to form food lines, for example. But if you have no randomness in the system, that if the environment changes, the system can't reorganize itself to adapt to the changing environment. So in terms of the food line, an example of this is from a distance, you look at a food line and it looks like a straight line. But if you bend down and look more closely, you see that there's always a few ants that aren't following the line. And when I was a kid, these are the ants I thought that were evolutionarily challenged. I just felt sorry for them.
I'm pointing at the evolutionarily challenged ant.
Right.
Stick around to the end. We're very important.
There you go. And I think we all are, and anyone probably listening to your podcast, probably to some extent. I prefer the word divergent ant.
That's right.
But though every ant has the potential to be divergent, but that's a separate thing. So you look at the food line, looks like a straight line. Go closer, there's a few ants, 3-4%, that aren't following the line. It turns out that if you step your foot in the middle of the line, it's the divergent ants that will most rapidly find another route around your foot. Or they're the ants that are going to find a new food source when this food source that all the other ants are busy carrying back to the colony, they'll find the new food source. So it's this low-level randomness that allows for adaptation. And that means that it's the low-level randomness that allows things to be alive. Stuart Kauffman, who's one of the founders of complexity theory and probably the leading thinker in terms of how it applies to biology, talks about how this randomness, this low-level unpredictability, gives rise to what he calls the adjacent possibles. In every moment, because there's this unpredictability, there's not one single machine-like outcome of the present moment. Living things are not machines, despite how our culture for a couple of hundred years has used that as the dominant metaphor. But our bodies are not machines. They have a low level of randomness, so there's always going to be a little fuzziness in what the next possible moment could hold. It's not infinite. It's not anything can happen. That would be total randomness, and you wouldn't get self-organization. But it's small changes. And so he refers to these as the adjacent possibles. And moment by moment, one of these is selected for the next moment. The cloud of adjacent possibles disappears. And with the inherent randomness, there's a new cloud of adjacent possibles. This means that living systems, whether it's our bodies or our political parties or our economies, you can give an idea of what the possible range of futures are, but you can never predict precisely. Because it's not like billiard balls. It's not like a machine. The other implication is that sometimes one of these adjacent possibles is death. The very same thing that makes it possible to be creatively adaptive and alive also risks, and this is a mathematical thing because you're at the edge of chaos, you can step out of the zone of complexity and have a mass extinction event, either partial or whole. And that's also full of new potentials. Inherent in this, then, is the idea that people may want to say we can live forever. People are actively talking about online all the time, that we can extend human lifetimes for infinity. No, you can't. You're a living thing. You're constrained. There will be a mass extinction event from within or without that will kill you. Sorry. And there's no such thing as a fountain of youth. So when I give this talk to medical personnel, I've noticed there's often sort of a settling in the room when I say this. And I think it's because I'm making concrete the fact that they're not there to keep people alive forever. If that were the benchmark for medicine, everyone practicing the healing arts would be a failure. It's about nurturing the creative adjacent possibles so that there may be a next moment and a next moment.
Jonathan, would you like to tell him all the things that you're doing for your longevity?
I don't think I should live forever, but just a little bit longer.
And that's probably playing with rules number 1, 2, and 3. 3 is feedback on the local level, not being global, So yeah, you can enhance the potential for creative opportunities.
Well, what you're defining is also, one of, I mean, I hope it's not obnoxious to point out, what you're talking about is also the basis of the evolutionary process as we know it, which is that differentness is what leads to challenges to a system that then allow for adaptation and essentially, in the most plain terms, a survival of the fittest. Meaning, if you have a new thing, I'm just going to call it a thing because you like that word, and I do too. If you have a thing that's going to do things a little bit different, it creates enough of a challenge to the system to create either, compensatory things around it or the potential for this to be the new thing. I wonder if you can talk a little bit, and we will fully circle back. I got a whole thing about how I'm going to circle back to integrative medicine and everything, and my Dr. Theise theory of everything, which is what I think your next book will be. This is my new thing: is I predict what books people should. I mean, I know what I want you to write about, so we'll work on that next. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit. When you were speaking about chaos theory. And, when I was at UCLA, already many moons ago, people were doing, ink blot research. And I was like, what? And it was like this crazy thing where there were literally people in the physics department who would study the patterns of what happens if you drop ink, on a piece of paper. And the way that it spread, like there were labs studying this. And I remember my mind was blown. I mean, I was studying neuroscience, which was the level that I wanted to understand. But there were people literally making mathematical predictions and quantum decisions about ink, that kind of movement. And, I couldn't help when you were talking about, the era when this kind of science sort of started, right? It was also an era where, if you've ever seen any images of fractals and fractal kind of, geometry, it's very trippy. It's very psychedelic. It's a lot of the imagery that many artists who have had transcendental experiences, whether with, LSD or with psilocybin, there are these images of repeating patterns that are intricate and complex. And I'm wondering if there's any sort of alignment with, this sort of notion that science has to move along at some sort of pace. I mean, it's a construct of our existence that we will have theories and we will have movements. So if this hadn't been, discovered by any individual person, it still existed. It still would have sort of come into our consciousness. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about sort of the notion of fractals and what the expanding consciousness also of the world, and in particular the United States, was like. Because for me, when I look at, scientific progress, it mirrored civil rights. It mirrored, what was going on a societal level. So I'm curious how you see sort of complexity, sort of starting to thrive intellectually at a time when we were thriving in really explosive ways.
I have an instinct to respond in two ways. Number one, I'm very cautious, given the kind of parallels I'm drawing between philosophy, religion, and science, to be careful not to stumble into mistaking similarities as more than metaphor.
Sure.
At the same time, I think there's a truth in there. The way I think to explore it, no one's ever asked me that question, so this is me working in real time. What's special about fractals is that it's a kind of geometry that could not be revealed prior to the development of computers. You generate fractals by putting the appropriate equations into a system, which are not resolvable like you easily. Like you can put in, the equation for right triangles, the Pythagorean theorem, a squared equals b squared, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And there you have a right triangle described in all its properties. You can use trigonometry to describe curves, and you have it all there. And you don't have to run it over time in a computer to see what the shape is. You can just plot it and see it. Fractals could be seen because you could have programs that would continually repeat their operations. They were open-ended and never came to a full stop. And some of those equations, Benoit Mandelbrot is the man who basically discovered these and presented these to the world, showed that you had these extraordinarily beautiful images. But what's special about them is that they repeat themselves over scales. So you look at it from this distance and you see a fractal, and then you go in really closely to look at the tiny little filigrees, and they look like the same fractals. And then you go in closer and look, and there are more fractals. And mathematically, it's an infinite regress. So you just get, it's called self-similarity across scales. And so a piece of a triangle doesn't look like the same triangle you took it out of. It could if you section it just right, but it doesn't necessarily. And what was important about the discovery of fractals, and to some extent it came from the study of the natural world, is that we see them all over the place. Once you've seen them, you see a picture of them, you sort of look up and go, oh, look at the fractal nature of the way a trunk of a tree goes up and they branch. And each of those branches looks like a smaller version of the trunk. And they branch. And each of those twigs looks like a smaller version of the branch. It doesn't go on infinitely, obviously. It ends in a leaf. And this, again, the simplicity of things. You can look at, a picture from my work. I could take a photograph to highlight the arteries and veins in an organ. And if I said to you, if I made it black and white and showed it to you and said, this is a picture of the Mississippi Delta, you'd go, sure. Because they're the same fractal system. Or you're flying in a cloud and you see these cumulus clouds and they're all fluffy. And then you fly in closer and you see the same fluffies. And you can't seem to get at it because it just keeps revealing smaller and smaller versions of the same thing. So that's the special nature of fractals, and we have them in our system. And fractal mathematics describes the way electrical conduction happens in the heart, the way your airways branch in your lungs, the way your blood vessels branch in your body, etc. And that's the mathematics that describes chaos. So complexity, it's not quite in the zone of chaos, but it's also not quite in the zone of order. And Roger Lewin, one of the authors of an earlier book on complexity for a lay audience 20 years ago, talked about it's almost as though chaos and order are pulling at each other. And what erupts at that place where they're pulling at each other is life. David Packard, who came up with this phrase, the edge of chaos, to describe what complex systems are and where they lie mathematically, went from there to say that not only is it what describes life, but what's from an information theory point of view, which I don't go much into in the book because it's really not my domain. But one way of thinking about life, we now know that information is a measurable thing in the universe. It's a quantity. It's not just a word we have for facts or zeros and ones. It's a property of the universe. And
what does that
the
mean?
richest information.
Can you explain that before you go on? Because I feel like I'm not going to understand what you say next unless you explain what that means. Information. What did he say, Jonathan?
Information is a measurable thing in the universe.
It's not just like, oh, we have information. But what does it really mean?
This goes under the category of information theory. This is where I turn from polymath into dilettante, dancing on the edge there. I like edge zones. So you can mathematically describe information content in the world. And this gets into, it's sort of, it's properly within both mathematics and physics. It describes physical systems. A lot of what Stephen Hawking was going at when he developed his theories of black holes in the beginning is, can information be lost or not? If something falls into a black hole, isn't information lost? And if I'm not mistaken, what he said is, no, it is maintained. Right. And in Hawking radiation, that radiates out. And so it was an information theory question. There's information content in the universe, and it can be measured and quantified and described by equations. And where information processing is most rich is in living systems. So you can think of it in terms of, the air conditioner. What information does it need to pull from the room? What's the temperature?
Mm-hmm.
That's it. It needs one bit of information. And I'm not sure whether I mean bit technically or
Sure.
just
Yeah.
a small thing. But for a living thing to be alive, what do we have to monitor in order for our body to adjust to make it to the next moment? We've got to be worrying about the tiger coming at us. We've got to worry about, do we have enough water? Will we have enough water tomorrow? What's the temperature? Is it raining? Is it too dry? Are we in sun? Are we in shade?
Are we able to, turn off the conscious experience of like, oh my God, there's clothing on my body and it feels weird, but we have to tune that out to be able to just do the next thing.
Right. So the complexity of information processing is another thing described by complexity. And you can restate complexity in terms of information theory like this. So David Packard went down that route. And the result was he talked about evolution as being a drive towards greater richness of information processing. Not in terms of survival of the fittest, but in terms of optimizing and increasing information processing. Mm-hmm. And those are not the same thing. They're complementary. But it's another aspect of how to think about evolution and life. It's the evolution of information processing.
This is going to take us off track, but maybe we'll do a little dog leg and then come back.
Dog leg?
A little like roundabout.
Oh.
It's
a cute expression.
Because they are like, they're a little shaped and then they go around.
I didn't know that.
They're a little
okay,
hunches.
Sorry.
Anyway.
Dog leg.
Some would say that the advancement of our modern day society has actually limited our ability to, or corrupted our fundamental human ability of information processing, knowing what to prioritize and what not to, hence the epidemic of mental health crises and crisis of purpose and meaning.
I mean, it's a complexity overload, but not in the way that you talk about complexity in a layperson's terms.
Right.
It's a complexity overload.
Yeah. And one of the ways I think about this, when I think about any question someone asks me about, well, how do you deal with this in terms of complexity? I go back to the first 4 rules. And to me, what sticks out is our communications have become increasingly complex. Mm. And in the early days of the internet, that meant greater diversity. But then the tools by which we access this diverse amount of information started to create algorithms that started to pare back the negative feedback loops of normal human interaction. No, that's false. We're not going to buy into that. That's true. That has a lot of evidence for it.
I'm fine just the way I am.
Positive feedback loop.
Right.
And so this is like a cancer of information processing. So what happens when positive feedback loops predominate is you can still get self-organization, but it's no longer creative and adaptive. So in a banking system, you eliminate too many of the negative feedback loops of legislative control of how banks work, and you get a Great Depression, you get a Great Recession, you get an economic bubble, which is a self-organizing thing. It's that bubble, but it's not adaptive. It's rapidly expanding, energy expending, and it collapses. Cells in the body that stop responding to other cells according to local controls of negative feedbacks become a cancer. What does cancer do? It expands and then energy depletion and collapse. I think that when you look at social media, where I'm thinking, who am I? I'm a liver pathologist. But being caught up in the middle of it and seeing how the algorithms are doing things to my Facebook feed, because I'm so old I use Facebook and not much else. It's a pruning away of the negative feedbacks that told us as a community, this is trustworthy, this is not. You can look at something like Nazi Germany, any autocratic society, where they start pruning away freedom of the press, means that you're pruning away the negative feedbacks that allow people to assess truth versus untruth. And we're in a system now that random things can be pumped up into appearing true because the algorithms have removed the constraints on that would allow us to distinguish truth from untruth.
Totally agree with all of that. And when you talk about cancer of information processing, you're talking primarily about digital information.
But it's also social. Those are not separate things.
100%. It's the main way in which we interact with other people. I was also thinking about our physiological changes and the environments that we live in and our separation from nature as a cancer of information processing and how it would remove our inherent knowledge and ability to know, I need temperature control or sunlight or,
No, I completely agree with you. And I had intuitions about this stuff going back to when I was a kid. When I first moved to New York City, I grew up in West Hartford, which was borderline at that time, suburban to rural. I mean, there were cow pastures close. Those are all shopping malls and condominiums now, but still. But I felt like I had a direct connection to the ground, to the sky. And when I first moved to New York City, it was to attend grad school. I'd only gotten into one grad school, and it was in New York. So, okay. I used to like visiting here, but the idea of being here, and I was explicit, cut off from birds and grass and trees. I was far enough away from Central Park that I didn't, and busy enough with school that I didn't, I got into this box. That was also, for a variety of reasons, when I had my first major depression. And a lot of that was simply about being gay. And that was when I was starting to come to terms with it. And medical school was not a really great place in which to do that. But at the same time, I felt untethered. From our arrival, I felt untethered. And when I mentioned before about, describing to be a living thing, you have to be monitoring so much. We evolved within the natural world setting. We evolved to be sensitive to starlight and moonlight and sunlight and the patterns of growth and death in the world around us and all of that. And we've lost that once we started establishing cities. And that started with extractive agriculture, So I think in the last 10,000 years, we've been getting more and more abstracted from the world we arise from. I don't think it's a surprise that was like, 10,000 years or so ago. And then you start to have 5,000 or 6,000 years later, these, what we call the great religions, very, popping up all over the place. And I think it was the necessity after a few thousand years of abstraction to find ways to reconnect, even within the midst of that abstraction. And that's what I think that a lot of the spiritual traditions are doing. They're going inward to find those connections, even as outward we're pulled away.
That's a lot. That's not enough as far as we're concerned in this room.
It's beautifully said.
It's really beautiful. And that is where I wanted to go next, because to my understanding, you are a person of a complex faith, for lack of a better description. Mm-hmm. And also, from the bit that I know about you, you've had at least, the experiences that I've heard you, most familiar with, you contemplated rabbinical school, you were a somewhat serious student of, let's say your ethnic and cultural, and historical kind of faith. And also you've, chosen a life committed to Zen Buddhism in particular, which has a lot in common with many mystical aspects of the Jewish tradition. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I keep coming back to from the second you started speaking, sort of everything you describe, is that there is a unity in complexity, and there is a concept of a oneness, which for me and for my, religious leanings tend towards a very, specific and in many cases mystical concept of the oneness of both God and the universe, right? And for me personally, my understanding of of what is divine is the exact structures that you're talking about, the systems that you're talking about. Like, I find the beauty in the fact that everything breaks down to atoms and neutrons and, all like that. To me is, I don't need any more proof. Like, people always ask, like, how can you be a scientist and a person of faith? Like, there's not even a question for me, because as sure as electrons exist, I am observing them, trying to come up with equations to understand them. I mean, it's like, it's a non-issue for me. But you said something really interesting in one of your talks. And what you said was that, religion, God, this seems to be an arena that people are very uncomfortable kind of talking about, because we don't have an equation and we don't have a way to quantify, and we don't have this kind of like proof. And I wonder if you can speak about, in the complexity of everything that you see, everything that you study, where is the kind of, peace that you find in being a person of really any divine faith?
Good question. So to me, and I think I discussed this fairly explicitly in the afterword to the book, all these concepts are useless to bring me peace, to give me resilience. To me, they're pointers at something that has that potential. But in the book, I talk a lot about Einstein, I talk a lot about Heisenberg, and I talk a lot about Kurt Gödel, who was a lot of where I go in the last half of the book. He's also, I think, not as well known a figure in 20th century thought, in modern thought, as he should be, because he's fascinating. And maybe my chapter on him will, someone will go, oh, that would make a good movie. Oh, look who I'm talking to. But never mind that. Gödel himself acknowledged verbally, Einstein and Heisenberg, I don't think ever actually did. Their incredible knowledge and their incredible intuitions about the nature of existence did not save them from vast amounts of suffering, both the suffering they felt and the suffering they caused. Because being smart about the concepts is just not enough. When we're talking about that connection to the world that makes you feel whole, like we were just describing, the ideas of how to do that don't do it. It's the experience of connecting to the world, whether it's by getting out of your city and going for a walk in the woods, or maybe it's just going to Central Park, or maybe it's just showing up for the person who's your neighbor. In a fully present way, the way you'd be fully present if you were looking at a bird in a tree, and with every fiber of your being. Those experiences reveal the unity of things. One way to get at it is contemplative practice, which is where the reason you can get there through many ways. Devotional practice, and my mom is an example of that. To some extent, the book about her is going to be a case study of the impact of deep devotion. She felt directly connected. I needed something a little bit more. And what drove me was being a child of Holocaust survivors. And that drove me in two ways. One was that growing up in the Jewish faith, in a very rich, warm environment, it wasn't something that the kids in my family and my community were feeling oppressed by for the most part. We were the first generation after the Holocaust. We were the treasure. We were the future. But how could that have happened? And I remember when I first discovered Jewish mysticism, it was in the novel The Source by James Michener that someone gave me. And there's a chapter on it on Jewish mysticism. And it talked about, unification with God. And I thought, oh, maybe there's a God's eye view from which all of this makes sense. And the job of the mystic is to try to get that God's eye view. So to me, that was the impetus. And that wasn't accessible to a Jewish suburban gay kid in West Hartford in the 1970s. Then I discovered Zen Buddhism, and that was a way to meditate because I read how people with enlightenment experiences, quote unquote, sounded like they were 15th century, 16th century mystics. So that's how I went down that path. What I discovered in the process is that when you go inside to experience the world through your own mind, what you find is there is a mind that precedes everything. Little tiny flashes maybe I get of this as being a direct experience, but I know that that's the route to have that experience. And what arises from that experience of unity is a greater resilience when you come back to this.
Mm.
And in the community of Holocaust survivors, there were people who survived broken, and there were people who survived with the capacity for great resilience and joy. And being coming of age in New York as a gay man during the AIDS crisis, many, many people died terrible, horrible, pain-ridden, fear-filled deaths. But I know people who died in bliss states. The ones who were in the latter category had some sort of direct experience of things, a direct understanding. So what I hope for with a book like mine is exactly what you said. People who have an interest in science, who share our cultural notion that science, empirical science and mathematics are the surest way to know the true nature of reality. Quantum physics and Kurt Gödel with his incompleteness theorem show that they are not sufficient. And you also need intuition and experience. And there are ways to cultivate those intuitions and experiences. And that's the piece that's missing from our culture, I think. We're not a machine. Science and math don't explain everything. And one of the ways to get there that's been useful for me is when the mind turns inward, what does it find? It finds a greater mind. And that's the mind, we call it in our writing fundamental awareness, that's just pure awareness, out of which space-time itself arises, out of which the quantum foam and the quantum particles arise, and self-organize themselves the way ants and cells do into atoms, into molecules, into the whole universe. So it's a pointer that this is the structure of reality, and underlying it all is this one fundamental awareness that's pure awareness. And as it contemplates itself, we spring into existence.
Okay. First of all, you're fucking awesome. You're blowing our minds. Second of all, wait for it. I'm going to bring it back to something you mentioned, like kind of in passing. When we talk about mind-body syndrome, and when we talk about this sort of like, very kind of recent, in terms of sort of like clinical literature, journalistic and longitudinal study literature, we finally sort of have science waking up to a very specific experience in the universe that for a very long time, some might argue for as long as we've existed as conscious, Homo sapiens sapiens, that we have had and known about. And, when you mentioned, I think it was in one of your videos, when you mentioned, kind of like starting to delve into like mind-body work, for me, for Jonathan, for people who have sort of, by hook or by crook, have had to have a very intimate relationship with our emotional systems and our physical systems. And this is a set of skills that many of us come to not because we want to, but because we have to. And what I think is so interesting is, when you talk about exactly what you spoke about, this combination of, the mathematical, the chemical, the physical. I mean, you were explaining, ATP in your book, right? And also, you as a scientist and you as a person, you're also holding that there's this other element of our awareness and of our consciousness that is not distinct from that. And, I have a list of things that the hippies might have been right about. And, this is one of them, that our emotional system and our physical system they're not distinguishable from each other. And it's like, oh, thanks, we finally have the science, to prove it. And I cannot help but link it back to, this notion of an interstitial, I made it a Jewish word, an interstitial system that you were part of this incredible research. I think it
Mhm.
kind of was published in 2018. For me, it's all connected because it's all you. And what this research found, and it was a large, beautiful team, what it found was sort of the words and the numbers and the histology that matches what many of us have felt, have experienced, and have been working on, which is that there is a system in the body. There's a physiological system that is related to organs, to structures, and to systems that breathe, that literally have movement related to breath in terms of their health and in terms of their sickness, their dis-ease. And people who do fascia work, for example, like we know these people. I've had this work done. And
You do.
in simplest terms, what fascia work does is it pulls your skin. What it feels like is your skin's being pulled off your bones, which isn't a thing. But the work that you did is so powerful because what it shows is what people experience when they have work done that implies that the fluid cavity essentially that runs, through your whole body, that it surrounds organs, that when you breathe, it matters. When you constrict, it matters. When something is wrong and it impedes your emotional sense of existence, there's a physiological way to also cause rest and contemplation in the body. And that is literally what, in particular, Buddhism has known for thousands of years. There also is a Kabbalistic tradition. There is a mystical Jewish tradition that mirrored in many ways, when they say 3 stars, 3 men came from the East, the East people, the East. So I wonder, I know I just said a lot and possibly too much, but can you speak a little bit to your, kind of collaborative work surrounding the notion of what the mind-body system has been trying to convince people matters?
Right. So
I got
first
so
off, just the
excited.
fact that we
Sorry.
have, yeah, that this phrase mind body, that goes back to Descartes, which said mind body, not one, and clearly that's not true.
Oh,
As you
Descartes.
said, that guy. And who the other half of that, the mechanics of the universe, that's Newtonian mechanics. But most people don't realize that Newton wrote far many pages about alchemy than he did about physics. So this was not his problem, So when we talk biologically about the interstitium, what we found was that when you take bits of tissue out of the body to look at it under the microscope, you do things to cut a very thin slice on the slide. You fix it with chemicals that bind molecules together so they hold their relationships, even as you're slicing down. And then you stain it with pretty colors so you can see the individual bits. And part of that process is drying it. Tissue preserves, let's say, in mummification, because you're drying it. And something that has no water in it, no bacteria are going to be able to go in there and live and eat it because they need water like the rest of us do. So it dehydrates. And so when you look at tissues that are rich in collagen, it always looks in the body like a wall. So when you said around our organs and between our organs, everywhere in the body where you have collagen in layers, the below the epidermis of the skin, which is the outer layer, below that you have the dermis, and it's this dense collagen. But if you look at it under the microscope, like I do every day, there's always cracks, little spaces between the collagen bundles, and we know that collagen is so stiff that when that needle goes through, that knife goes through to make the thin slide, it cracks. And so we've seen these in tissues since we started looking, at human tissues in a modern way, probably 150 years ago or so, and that's artifact. That's just artifact because collagen is stiff. Some colleagues of mine had this new fancy endoscope. So, looking for colonoscopies, if coming up that way, or looking at your esophagus or stomach, et cetera, going down, where you could do microscopy in the living tissues by injecting fluorescent dye in a vein, and all the fluid in your body lights up. And when they looked at areas where they could get into the connective tissue of the body, there were all these spaces that were bright. That doesn't look like anything in this dense collagen network. And it turns out, because this is the nature of the living tissue, with fluid flowing freely through it, all through your body. It's one single network of mostly collagen. But you don't see it when you make a slide to look at it under the microscope because it all collapses. The cracks that we thought were artifact were the remnants of the actual living tissues. And so what we showed in our paper is that the connective tissue of the body has this fluid going through it. Now, I had a rolfer named Debbie Green. She was also my yoga teacher, and she would be working my fascia. And, I would sometimes need a towel to bite down on because my body is, I've got issues. And she'd say, well, there's fluid in the fascia. And I'd say, no, there's not. I can show you under the microscope. And she'd say, yes, there is. I can feel it under my thumbs. And I'd say no. And we just were like, we'll agree to disagree. And I actually have a picture of fascia in the original paper for her because she was right. What I was looking at to say it wasn't there is because the artifact, we dehydrated the tissue. The fluid was gone. The living tissue, it's right. Now, when we presented this, it went viral as possibly the 80th organ. We didn't put that in the paper, but that came out in the fuss and bother. And there was no other science news that week. Stephen Hawking had died 2 weeks before, so that had already passed from the news. They needed something to fill it. Fascia world was up in arms and the osteopaths and many different traditions, because they've been talking about this for 40, 50, 60, 70 years. What do you mean this is new? Well, in allopathic medicine, what we mean, when we think of Western medicine, this was new. It wasn't in our literature, except for little hints here and there. And I realized, the reason isn't because it didn't exist and they didn't see it. It's because my medical community was preventing it from being published. But then I was in China because I do liver pathology and liver disease, and I was there for a liver conference. And a liver guy there who I found out, I didn't know this, was the head of a Chinese version of NIH for traditional Chinese medicine. And so he got the first question out of honor, out of respect for him. And his first question was, so how have people responded to your work? And I said, well, some people are like, you're crazy. What do you mean there's spaces here? And other people, fascia world, was angry because, they'd been saying this for decades. And he smiled and nodded and said, yes. And we've been speaking about it for 5,000 years, referring to traditional Chinese medicine.
Correct.
So the interstitium, what is it? It's a fluid-filled path through the body that we didn't know about, that's 4 times the size of the cardiovascular system, crosses all organ boundaries, all tissue boundaries, and it's a communication network, which in complexity terms is increasing the diversity of interactions of how the body can speak to itself, right? And so what we're talking about is communication. And so what I realized very soon by these interactions was the interstitium, metaphorically, can act as the space by which all these different traditions of health and healing can speak to each other. Because we all have, hands on the elephant. We all have a view. But having the anatomy allows us, that everyone recognizes as something they've been talking about, but we couldn't ever specify, became an interstitium. It has that potential to be an interstitium across cultures of health and healing. And then you step back and think in terms of complexity. It's the spaces it's the local spaces where interactions happen between neighbors that allow for the arising of complex systems, living systems, creativity, and adaptation. So that's a metaphor.
Oh,
but it's
I
a really
get it.
good one.
It's
But
also
it's
a
a really
great
good
Dave
one.
Matthews song. I can't help but think of the notion of the creation of the universe. There's a mystical, there's a Kabbalistic, notion that there was light in a vessel, and that light was shattered, and the light was scattered all over the universe. And our job as humans is to gather all of these bits of light and to sort of reassemble this vessel, in some way. And I also thought of the Leonard Cohen quote, "There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And that's which obviously he draws heavily.
Can I throw in another one?
Do it.
And Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav said, the only heart which is whole is the heart that has been broken.
That is true.
Which to me is because the cracks are where the light gets. Yeah.
That's right. So this is my next question. So the fascia thing, which we've spoken about here, and we will continue to speak about. And Jonathan is an energy person, and I consider him a healer, even though he's very humble about it. But what else are we allowed to say to people? Like, I promise this is true, without having to sort of wait, for this next level. Like, do we wait another 5,000 years? And I think,
No. Yeah, so another key piece, which I haven't mentioned, of the universe as a complex system. And this is, for us, I think this is really fundamental, fundamentally important. So at this level of scale, we are separate bodies. You two are sitting there and you look like objects in your room, and I'm over here. And if we were in the same room, I'd be a third object in your room. Our boundaries are our skin. And that's the way we think of ourselves. But at the cellular level, where are our boundaries? So you're shedding skin cells into the environment all the time. The dust in your room is in large part just your dead skin cells, which is a little disgusting, but I'm a pathologist, so I can, I'm okay with it. But now we know about the microbiome, which are the bacteria and other living things that line the surfaces of your body and all the crevices inside your body. And we know that without our microbiome, if we were completely sterile, we would die within days. Our skin would start to crack, we'd get infections, we'd be unable to absorb food, our immune systems would go haywire. So we're not a living human body without our microbiome. And current estimates are 50% of your cells are your human cells, and 50% of your living body necessarily are these bacteria and other stuff.
Did you say 50%?
If you put a bunch of people in an apartment and have them live together.
Did you say 50%?
50%.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's actually down. The estimate used to be around 90%.
Do I exist? It's really the question.
Yeah, right. So at the cellular level, where are your boundaries? If people who share a home, all the people who share a home and their pets all share a single microbiome. You come in with your own microbiomes, but within a very short time, this has been studied and measured, your microbiomes emerge into one single system. So at the cellular level, where are your boundaries? They're the boundaries of the spaces we occupy with other people and animals and whatever. At the molecular level, where are your boundaries? Simplistically, we breathe out carbon dioxide. Our carbon dioxide of our bodies goes out to the plants. They take it in, make it part of their bodies, and give us oxygen. At the molecular level, the boundary of our bodies is the entire biomass of the planet. At the atomic level, we see ourselves as being these isolated individuals walking around on this rock we call planet Earth. But there is no atom in our bodies that we didn't breathe, eat, or drink from the planet. So are we separate individuals walking around on the surface of planet Earth, or are we the atomic substance of the Earth that in 3.5 billion years have self-organized according to the rules of chaos and complexity theory into living things that think of themselves as separate? I use this example in the book. It's kind of one of my favorites. When Curiosity went to Mars and I was blown away, and 14-year-old geek, like, oh boy, if I could have been a part of NASA, the brilliance of the scientists and engineers at NASA that they could send this robot to Mars. That's true. But equally true is that it took 3.5 billion years for Earth to figure out how to organize itself so that it could reach out and touch its neighbor.
100%.
At the quantum level, there are no boundaries. Each of us is fully an expression of the universe, one single large unity within which there's no separation. So how does this affect fascia? Well, I in Fascia World, they ask me about this stuff. So they ask me different questions. And, you know, when you come in and you want to work on a broken bone, you can do, you know, mechanical stuff at this level of scale, pin it, we can do cellular interventions. We can do cell transplants. We can do molecular interventions. We give medicines. At every level of scale, the body exists as in all these different ways. And at each level of scale, there are ways to observe and experience the body and to interact with it. And so when a skilled healer comes into a room, they are sharing a space with their client, their patient, the other person in the room. And their boundaries are already, they're not two separate humans. We're never separate. We just focus at this level of scale so obsessively that we think we are. But at the energetic level, when you have a healer come and bring their body in proximity to your body, it's one system. It's one energetic system. It has to be. They're not separate. And so, yes, a skilled practitioner can sense things and can influence things, and healing can arise out of the interactions between these two people. Or on a larger scale, communally, socially, things like that happen. So it's all because we're so bound up in our day-to-day scale of observation. I'm lucky as a pathologist, I get to practice every day looking at the body at another level of scale. Airplane pilots are lucky. They get to practice looking at the world at a higher level of scale. We all know it when you're in an airplane and you're watching as you come in for a landing. You're above the world, you're above the world, you're above the world. And then it's almost a visceral feeling sometimes that you get this shift where suddenly you're in the world. Well, can we think of the body as layer after layer after layer till you get down to the quantum realm and you're just the universe?
Dr. Theise, I don't know where I end and you begin, literally. That's what I'm feeling like.
No. But equally true, you're your body and I'm my body. Both are true.
Well, it's funny. So, and it's funny that you bring this up because, you know, one of the things that I think so many of us, especially those of us who come from complicated childhoods, those of us who come from intergenerational trauma, those of us who, you know, you give an example, are struggling with sexual identity or gender identity, people who, you know, are living in a place where boundaries are curious, a place where boundaries are often uncertain. You know, that notion is both a psychological one, but I don't think it's always wrong to say that that's also a physical one. And you mention in passing on one of your videos, you mentioned in passing, a shaman thing. And in your book, you do not mention by name, but you mention healers who have had a profound impact on your life. You know, I have interacted with shamans for, you know, various reasons. Jonathan has as well. And we usually kind of like joke about it because most people are like, that's crazy. And maybe it is. But, you know, what Jonathan and I have experienced is that, I mean, I'm not speaking for you. Should I speak for you?
You usually do. We joke also that in LA it's become trendy, but like 20 years ago, not everyone had a shaman in their Rolodex.
Right.
My question about, you know, that kind of healer, you know, and I think a lot of people talk about shamans now because people talk about ayahuasca and everybody's, you know, learning about shamans in a different way, not just from Carlos Castaneda books, which is how, you know, I learned about shamans for the first time when I was a teenager. What'd you say?
But now from Goop.
Yes, now you can learn about shamans from Gwyneth Paltrow herself. But I do think it's an important point that in the same way that 5 years ago, 40 years ago, 80 years ago, 1,000 years ago, you know, in the same way that we are continuing to learn about these kind of intersections of places where people have access to a different concept of boundaries, I think it's very important. I worked with a healer. I think I've talked about this here. It sounds ridiculous to say. I worked with a healer, and the first time that we worked together, she said, I'm not comfortable even putting my hands on your feet. And I said, what do you mean? That's why I'm here. It's like, why I was sent to you is because I need hands-on work, and I'm told that you do something. I had never been to a healer before. And she said, I'm not going to be able to put my hands on your feet because your body's not allowing me to. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I came here, and what ended up happening was years of work with this woman who has since gone on to another realm. But I learned more about what she meant and what that means to have a body that says no when when I'm literally laying with my eyes closed on a table. And it was something that I didn't understand. And when people hear that, they're like, she just wanted to take your money. And what I've learned is something that people like Jonathan know, people like is that there literally is something to these kinds of healers. Can you say whatever you're comfortable telling us about your experience with people who heal on that level?
To some extent, this is that next book about my mom. If in this book, I'm saying that the whole world is non-material, is pure fundamental awareness that organizes itself into things that think of themselves as existing independently and materially, then why wouldn't there be non-material realms and non-material beings that are also arising from that consciousness that I can experience in consciousness, like in dream states or trance states or meditative states? And what was happening with my mom, I think, this is the way I think of it, and in my experiences with having inadvertently met a shaman and getting pulled into some of those practices, she was having encounters with non-material realms and non-material beings. And part of, I speak in the book about how one has to be careful discussing things like this in terms of insights from meditation, because how do you distinguish them from delusion and psychosis, etc.? I mean, there's that. I'm a scientist. I have to be careful about this.
That's also culturally independent, meaning, when I studied psychological anthropology at UCLA, we were taught about tribes in this case, in North Africa, who, when someone believes that they are hearing and seeing things that are not there and that they've been possessed by she-demons, that's actually a culturally appropriate, reaction to certain circumstances. Right. And those people were treated as very special shamans and healers. And so all of these things are very culturally dependent.
Right. So it remains tricky. But for me, I had this shamanic teacher over here who my mother knew nothing about. Basically, she lost her short-term memory for the last 8 years of her life. That was the primary thing. And she lived in this perpetual bliss bubble, kind of an awakened state by the end. But, you can't exist in an awakened state because you won't know how to feed yourself. So she needed 24-hour home care, etc. But she would come and report to me things about someone she met while she's out and about wandering other realms. And I'd get the report from my teacher how he met my mother, and they would independently tell me about the same conversation.
What?
So, my mother knew someone back home had died before I did because another dead person cut his stay short, which she was happy about. He was sort of boring her because he had to go welcome this person. I thought this person would be 104. That can't possibly be him going to welcome her because she died. And then I go home and get a message that that's exactly what happened. So I have little tethers for it's like, okay, there was an experiment that someone set up that I didn't know about, and we got the result, and like, okay, there it is. But going back to what I was saying about, pre-urbanization, extractive agriculture, what did we do with our time? My understanding, you probably know more about this having training in anthropology than I do, that The few societies of hunter-gatherers that have been left that we could go interfere with by studying, thereby disrupting their, but whatever. It's what we do. They spend very little time hunting and gathering. You don't have to spend all your life day in and day out. So in the absence of any distractions, what have you got? You've got talking, you've got playing, you've got having sex, maybe you have some war, and you have a lot of sitting about. And everybody has attentive capacities to the world around us. And if we didn't have our phones distracting us continually, all of us who have lived long enough to remember not having cell phones, we remember that we had states of mind where we were more alert to what was going on around us. And we miss that because our phones are now taking our attention. Well, in a world like that, where there was nothing to take your attention except social interaction and the natural world, some people would be sensitive to it. Some people would be more sensitive to it. Everyone can play the piano. Some people will be able to play chopsticks rather than make noise. Some people will be able to play some simple tunes. And occasionally there's a Mozart. I think what shamans are is that they're on the range of human capacity for understanding the world around us, including the non-material realms. And they were the adepts that either came to it by training or instinct. It can run in families. I think that's some of what's going on in my mom's case. And so those people would have these abilities. We find it strange now because all of us are so abstracted. We've got no framework within which to understand who they could be and why, what they're experiencing and why. But so to me, when I talk about shamanism, what I'm talking about is the awareness, the potential awareness that almost everybody has for experiencing the world around us deeply, and sometimes experience things that go beyond the material. I couldn't put that in this book because that would be a problem.
You're like, if this isn't complex enough, get a load of this.
Yeah. And it's not something that's amenable, I think, to scientific and mathematical rigor. So this book, to some extent, I didn't realize this until after I'd written it, that, oh my God, I'm trying to write a takedown of materialism. For the last 20 years, I haven't framed what I'm doing as that. But in writing the book, I realized that's part of what I'm doing. Is materiality is a scale-dependent, choice-dependent state of affairs. And yeah, everything, I'm tapping my computer. I'm tapping my camera now. Everything seems solid. Just what all the mystical and metaphysical traditions say. The world appears solid, but it ain't.
It's a projection. I mean, it's all just a projection.
I don't think that science and the mystics are in conflict the way that they have been presented for so many years. And I think more and more science is moving towards trying to understand many of the aspects that the mystics and natural Chinese medicine have been trying to communicate. And so in that way, I think it's hopeful. You know, your friend's work who's trying to understand the influence of the microbiome and different disease states or afflictions. We're studying more and more about using fMRIs to understand brainwave states to try to access different realms of consciousness and understand that we can control the autonomic nervous system and that it's not necessarily something that's totally outside of our control, and get us more back in touch with the realms of nature that are influencing us and trying to understand. So it's still, I think, of course, not mainstream medicine, but the conversation and people who are bringing this to the forefront are changing the paradigm of what it means to be scientifically valid versus, outside of that criteria.
And listen to the metaphor inherent in saying mainstream. Mainstreams come from small little tributaries that gradually collect together to create the mainstream that's the river, right? Mayim, you asked me before, and I never answered it because I went off on one of my fractal loops about the cultural state of affairs at the time that chaos and fractals and complexity were starting to emerge. What came to mind with that is what was going on at the beginning of the 20th century, the time in which quantum mechanics and relativity were coming up. The Industrial Revolution, Newtonian mechanics, and finally World War I in terms of Europe really shattered the social hierarchy that had the church, which depending on which location might have been a different church, but it was pretty much just a handful, who were all tied up in the power and structure of knowledge. There was no knowledge in Europe that was independent of church hierarchy. And when that started to break apart with the shattering of the monarchies, with the shattering of the church hierarchies, you had this explosion of political systems of thought, whether it's fascism, communism, democracy, and all the various subtypes, etc. This is because the economic order had been completely disrupted. So now you had free range to think of anything. Quantum mechanics and relativity displacing, returning humans to the center of attention. How you choose to observe something changes the nature of reality. It could only have happened in that kind of milieu when all the constraints were coming off. So I think science always reflects the society in which it's arising. Of course it has to, because it's an emergent property of that society. Societies are complex systems, and one of the things they give rise to, these global structures, are what's the nature of their economies? What's the nature of their politics? What's the nature of their science? What's the nature of their art? So, yeah, going back to that question, I think it's all intertwined.
And also, to kind of take that one step further, I always say Marx was right, but even to go beyond, sort of that particular revolution, the next revolution, which we know as the sexual revolution, right? And like the summer of '69 and Sergeant Pepper and like, oh my gosh, weed, like all these things that then became, an explosive movement. And in particular, one that did give birth to an aspect of mysticism and an aspect of transcendental exploration, which, 60 years later, right, we're coming back to in a way that is now, it's scientifically formulated that you may need psilocybin with a therapist holding your hand and telling you you're worthy, like that's because I think what a lot of people
or that you have the health insurance to cover it.
Also that, right? So there's also an elitism inherent, or you can get it on the street because we all are trying to connect somehow, like numb it out, make it hurt less, like fill the God-shaped hole, whatever it looks like. But, people of my parents' generation, my parents were also first-generation Americans, the notion was like, you're the miracle generation. You can do anything. You can think anything. And then you can think outside of the bounds of what your teachers told you. Like disobedience was an act of liberation, for a generation of liberal students all over the world. And it's not surprising, and I don't mean to get political, it's not surprising that then what came from that was a tamping down and regulation of research into LSD, because what they said is you cannot send people who have had a transcendental experience to war. They will not walk into war if they know that we are all connected on that level.
Well, yeah. And this is...
They're coming to get me. Do you hear the sirens? They're coming to get me.
One of the things I find really fascinating is that the mysticisms within religious hierarchies that are established are always suppressed and sometimes exterminated. If what I'm saying is correct, that the mystical impulse and the mystical experience shows the unity of everything, that's really dangerous to ordered hierarchies in which you separate things into good and bad, correct and incorrect. In the world of boundaries, This came to me in a dream once, and I was like, oh, this is a really good dream. Let me see if I can get it right. I heard someone saying to me in my dream, boundaries are where we give and we receive. In the realm of the boundless, meaning the fundamental unity, there are no boundaries, and therefore there is nothing to give and to receive. And that's why compassion arises from the experience of the boundless. Because you don't have to ask, what does this person need? What should I withhold? That's the compassion we do. Do I give someone money on the street, or do I call 911? Or, that's compassion. But real compassion, my hand hits the stove and it turns out it's hot, and my other hand leaps to pull it back. It doesn't stop and pause and think, should I do this? Will this put me in danger? Actions that arise from that sense of unity, that's real compassion. This is a Buddhist frame for this. What Buddhists talk, some Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhism will talk in particular about wisdom and compassion being the two main pillars of whatever. I can't think of the word. Wisdom is seeing the world as it is without delusion. Complexity theory and Gödel's theorem and quantum physics and biology, et cetera, to me, give us now the frame to see the world without delusion in a more complete way. And the result of that is compassion. So the wisdom is seeing the nature of true reality and cultivating a direct experience of it. What arises from that is true compassion. And that's what heals the world. That's what restores the sparks.
That's a mic drop. What do you, this is a, abstract question. What do you wish for? What do you wish for in terms of medicine, in terms of health? Like, what do you hope that your work can add to in the realm of sort of what I think a lot of us are experiencing as, a collective overwhelm, an overstimulation of information, of technology, complexity in ways that are not comfortable. What is your kind of vision? We know what one path of kind of understanding is. And I also know that that's not your field. You're a pathologist who also has, this incredible set of experiences and worldviews and perspective. But I'll listen to you first. What's your wish for the world of wellness and kind of health and the way we approach our lives right now?
There's a part of the afterword in the book that got written right at the very end of the last minute. It was almost like the next to last revision pass before final publication. And Mark, my husband, and I were hanging out with this young friend who was in his 20s, and we had been drinking a little bit. There was maybe a little disinhibition, and he spilled it about his anxieties and his fears, and about how we older people have screwed everything up and left him with very little. And I thought to myself, if I don't have something to say to him in this book, then why am I bothering? So, which made me realize I have to say something to that. And I think that's what it is. We can't avoid mass extinction events. They happen. I had my 2 little strokes a couple of months ago, which I mentioned. It's like, well, I had my 2 little strokes. I have a friend dealing with, from my Zen community. We were Zen students together. We came on board together. And she's in clinical trials now for recurrent breast cancer. And we were talking about this, and her oncologist said to her, "You're very unusual because most of my patients keep asking, why me?" And that's their question. And my friend responded, "That's not my question. My question is, why not me?"
That's right.
And I realized when I had my strokes, they were minor. I'm lucky, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But all the bad things that happened to me. In my younger years, I would ask, why me? Why is this happening to me? But after 35 years of Zen practice, the question is, why not me? Things happen. They just do. But if we could see it from a frame of reference that allowed us to go, okay, this is what's next. the Buddhist concept of impermanence, that is directly derivable from complexity theory too. That's in the book. You're living this terrific moment. It will end. You're living this horrible moment. It will end. Can you just go, this is this moment, this is the next moment? You may not survive. What do I do with my grandparents who were killed in the forests of Riga? They were German Jews, and that's where they were killed. If they, because of World War II, I exist. If it weren't for Hitler, I wouldn't exist. My father would never have met my mother. The world just keeps turning. So what are the adjacent possibles? Be content to be aware of the adjacent possibles and do what you can playing with the rules. If you want to be formal about it, the rules of complexity give you hints to bolster creativity, to cultivate adaptation. But mass extinctions also happen, and that's being alive. And that's not a bad thing.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, I think Dr. Theise wins as most awesome guest we've ever had.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I can't tell you how when they told me you were interested in a podcast, I thought, oh, these are people we've got so much to talk about. But I wasn't sure because you never know what an interviewer is going to do. It's like,
well, we don't, I mean, we try not to think of ourselves as interviewers. Jonathan actually found you for us. And I think we're
Thank you, Jonathan.
You're
very welcome. I didn't actually forget how I found you, but I was like, this guy we got to speak to.
Yeah, no, we just consider ourselves fellow travelers on this road. So thank you so much for speaking to us. And we wish you only good things with the book and continued healing, Refuah Shlema, on your stroke incidents. And
thank you. And to all of us for everything.
Amen. Thank you. Break it down.
No, it's not helpful. No one can hear you. You're not by your microphone.
This is how I feel into the interview. I'm on the floor.
Still no one can hear you.
I'm on the floor. I'm on the floor. Because that interview was so great. I can't even sit in my chair.
You love a scientist with a background in spirituality.
I love a scientist
who also has experience with shamans.
He's too much. He was perfect.
If there are scientists out there who also love shamans and are working on how to scientifically explain what the mystics have known for years and expand our understanding of consciousness, well-being, and how the body is really just a reflection of the universe.
He's everything
as a whole. Please reach out.
Okay. I just need to say one thing. I mean, I need to say many things. There's so many things. One of the things I need to say is I had never thought about life before the internet in the way that he talked about it. Meaning, of course, it's oh, we used to just you didn't know who was in that movie. You didn't know who that guy was. You would just never know. What was the name of that guy? I don't know. That was life.
There's a lot more I don't knows.
That's right. There's a lot more I don't knows. But I had never heard that kind of analysis of what a complete shift, You
had a lot more time to contemplate the stars.
Yeah.
And the moon.
I mean, not even contemplate, just we were in connection with a different, aspect of our existence. And I know that my kids and maybe a lot of people listening are that's just hand-wringing. This is just evolution. This is all part of it. But I really loved the way that he talked about, what that kind of interference kind of does to a system that is already so incredibly complex. He wrote a whole book about it. The book, Notes on Complexity, A Scientific Theory of Connection, Consciousness, and Being. I highly recommend the book. And also, he's got so many fascinating talks. Please check out Neil Theise. And I have nothing else to say. There's nothing else to say in the universe. This is our last episode. That's it. I got nothing else to say.
Well, it's a good thing that I'm a divergent member of our group, and I'm going to find a solution to make more episodes, so not to worry.
Also, I think we should definitely mention a couple incredible things that he said. Every ant has the possibility to be divergent.
Most of them are sheep, so they don't.
Most ants are sheep. That's the t-shirt we need to drop. Adjacent possibilities. I loved that concept.
Chaos and order are pulling at each other, and that's where life happens.
Maybe there's a God's eye view from where all of this makes sense. Also, quantum foam. Also, Descartes was wrong. He basically said that, and he was right.
Also, information is a measurable thing in the universe.
Hands on the elephant. Let's end there. Jonathan, what's the hands on the elephant?
We all have our different hand, like the different hands on the element are the different perspectives. And
Hold on one
it's
second.
so big and vast that you can't really see all the sides of it.
Well, it's found in Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain texts. A group of blind men hear that a very strange animal called an elephant has been brought to town. And they have to try and, figure out, like, what is it? What does it look like? And so one says, this is like a snake, because he's touching the trunk. And the other one's holding the ear, and he's like, it's like a fan, it's like a giant fan. And another said, it's like a tree trunk, as he's holding the leg. And then one man places his hand on the side of the elephant and says, no, it's just a wall, The tail is a rope. And the tusk is hard and smooth like a spear, It's all of those things. We're all just trying to explain what we're doing here, who we are, and how we exist. And
the only heart that is whole is the one that's been broken.
And if that doesn't teach you a little bit about boundaries, I don't know what will.
The boundaries of the body are the biomass of the planet.
Neil Theise is a freaking genius. From our breakdown to the one we hope you never have. We'll see you next time.
It's Mayim Bialik's breakdown. She's gonna break it down for you. She's got a neuroscience PhD or two. One fiction, one and now she's gonna break down. It's a breakdown. She's gonna break it down.
I have a couple fun questions. Can I ask you a couple fun questions?
Oh, please.
You met your husband at a Different Light bookstore. Can I ask which one? Was it the one in the Castro?
No, it was the one down in the village.
Okay, got it.
Right in Greenwich Village. Yeah.
Okay, yes, I figured.
But it was the same. It was the same people.
No,
Yeah.
No, it was a very sad. It was a very sad day when that closed in San Francisco, and so when I read in your book that's where you met, that just seemed like such a sweet story. I'm curious: is your husband scientifically inclined?
No, he's an artist type and a foodie. When I met him, he was here to assistant direct Burn This on Broadway from Canada, and then he stayed, and we met. And that was 35 years ago. Wow. And I met him the day I came out to my parents. I went to a Different Light bookstore. And, when I was a kid, Einstein was my hero. And every year, I would celebrate by bringing a cake in on Einstein's birthday to school. Eventually, I sort of let this go. I think early in medical school, I was like, this is looking silly. And Einstein had become a little more problematic at that point. I was in analysis, recovering from, suicidality and depression in medical school, and was ready to come out to my parents finally, and went to a Different Light bookstore, knew the book I wanted, but was so anxious I couldn't find it. He was the bookstore clerk. Went home.
And it was Einstein's birthday.
And it turned out, when I looked the day after, I thought, I should remember this day. It's like my birthday, my new birthday. And I realized, oh my God, it was Einstein's birthday.
Wow.
And then I went back to the bookstore and I snagged him a few months later. We moved in after our first date, and that's been it.
That's an amazing story. What is the tattoo on your left arm?
This one.
Yes. What is it?
That's a long story that has to do with my mother and requires some images that yeah. If we ever get to meet one day, I'll give you that story.
Amazing, but
that's a whole Kabbalistic.
I was going to say
it's a shamanic.
Okay, got it.
None of my tattoos. All of my tattoos are expressions of these paths that I'm on.
Okay, I'm not
And
going to ask you to take
they're
your shirt off, but where are the other tattoos?
I've got a buck over here,
Oh.
and I've got a fourth chakra on my back for the Divine Mother. This is the shamanic thing. I've got a warrior being over here I'm connected to. This is, do you know Ben Shahn, the artist, Jewish socialist artist from the 1950s?
Oh, yes, I think I know who you mean.
And he has a book called The Alphabet of Creation.
Yes.
So this is his alphabet of creation,
Oh my goodness.
superimposed on a Zen brush circle. So this is fundamental awareness giving rise to material reality via the alphabet.